So the author's apology, read it, and it's good. It's lots of good information. But we're going to start with a man under conviction. So if you have those notes, go ahead and open those. And we're going to start with the first sentence, which isn't very far, I know. We'll get faster. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where there was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep, and as I slept, I dreamed a dream. Now, the last term is the dream to dream. It wasn't necessarily literal, it was more of a fantasy. I had a fantasy. I had an imagination. This came out of my head. So that was what he would have written. I dreamed a dream, and that was what set people so against him. But he chooses some really interesting terms here. First, he says, it's the wilderness of the world. Now, think about the term wilderness, okay? Wilderness is a loaded term in the Bible. What does it typically refer to?
Walking around in the absence of the Lord's will.
Okay, almost. Let's keep going with that a little bit, though. You're walking around, certainly, in the absence of the Lord's will. Give me some examples of wilderness walking. It's frequently translated desert. Barren. But what are some biblical examples of people walking around in the wilderness or the desert? Exodus. That's an easy one, right? What else?
Jesus' temptation.
Mm-hmm. Good. So now with that, then Hagar was also, where did Moses go when he encountered the burning bush? In the wilderness, okay? So what was the wilderness then? When we see that people go out into the wilderness, into the desert, what is implied?
Were they tested?
Yeah,
Testing. What else? So let's go back to the Exodus example, for example, because we need to use the word example a little bit more often. So in the wilderness example of Exodus, what are the options? Right before they go into the wilderness, what was the actual option? Almost. Why were they sent into the wilderness?
They were disobedient.
Two.
They grumbled.
They grumbled.
They wouldn't take the land.
They wouldn't take the land. So what was their option?
To take the land.
Right. And so what did they do? Do you remember? They sent in the spies. The spies saw giants, came back and told the people, and the people said, forget it. Right? All except for? Joshua and Caleb. Right. Okay. So they were condemned to walk in the wilderness because they wouldn't take the promised land. Does that make sense? So what God said is, I'm not going to give you the promised land. I'm going to send you to the wilderness where you're going to have to do everything as the opposite of the promised land. Okay? The promised land was flowing with milk and honey. What did that mean? It was rich. It was abundant. Good life. Everything was easy. So with that, then what's the wilderness? Yeah, the opposite. What are you looking for? Everything. You have to go find it. In the land of milk and honey, where everything just kind of grows naturally, here you're having to go find food. With there, everything's perfect. Here you have to go and protect yourself from the animals. There, God's mercies and His providence are obvious. Here, to your point, you have to go search for it. It's harder to find. You don't see God's work as easily. Okay? Not at all. As easily. Does that make sense? Now let's consider some of the other examples, though. Jesus went out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses went out into the wilderness when he ran away from Egypt. Hagar went into the wilderness when she ran away from Sarah. Yeah. Right? And what happened to those three?
God met them.
Yeah, how? God met them.
An angel.
Yeah, multiple times, right? So we have Moses encountering the burning bush. We have Hagar encountering God in the wilderness. We have Jesus getting tempted, which makes sense, right? Because if the wilderness is this place where you're away from society, you're away from the blessings of God, you're away from all the things that are typical protections, then when would Jesus at least you'd think, be most vulnerable after being in the wilderness for 40 days. Makes sense, right? But look what Jesus did after being in the wilderness, tempted, and yet he overcomes. You see how the wilderness is not necessarily a place of cursing. It's not a place of punishment per se. It's not hell. Does that make sense? The wilderness is a place of danger, of difficulty, of challenges. Nothing's easy. Everything's hard. It's hard to see the blessings. It's a dry place with not a lot of, it's not Eden, but it's not bereft of God's sovereign purposes. It's not bereft of God's presence. Does that make sense? Because who led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, or 40 years? God did. Who was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights? God himself. Does that make sense? So when we look at the wilderness then of this world, now let's take some of those pictures and bring it over. What is Bunyan saying about the wilderness of this world? How does he picture the world? It's a great illustration. As he looks at the world, he sees
It's not heaven.
That's the easiest one, right? It's certainly not heaven. What is it? It's a wilderness. Wilderness of the world. Exactly. Good. So it's not heaven. If you look at heaven's the promised land and the world is the wilderness, then what do we expect? He's trying to set expectations for this world. What is the expectation as we walk through this world?
That everything's going to be hard.
Everything's going to be hard. There's a ton of challenges, but
God is there.
God is there. You see it? That's the wilderness of this world. So he says, as I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where there was a den. What is the den? The den is his prison cell. Okay? I lighted on a den. It's an interesting way of saying what happened without complaining about it. I lighted on a den, and there I laid me down to sleep. Because what else do you do in prison?
Just rest.
Well, now you watch TV and you work out and you rehabilitate and everything else. At the time, you sat and you rotted. That was prison at the time. And so now he says he goes into this den, he lays me down to sleep. Now you think about this, he wrote this in prison. Now, he didn't sit in prison and whine and complain and filled with self-pity and everything else. He didn't promise cursings. He wasn't doing 1,000 things that he could have done. Instead, he just sits down and decides to redeem the time by writing a book that lasts 400 years. That'd be nice. If I could do that too. All right. So there was a den. I laid me down to that place and sleep, and as I slept, I dreamed a dream. So he had this imagining fantasy. All right. Next. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, and his face, with his face from his own town, a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. All right. Now, there's a lot in here. We're not going to go through all of it. Sorry. Arsenal plays this morning, so my phone will light up with, hopefully, lots of score alerts and things like that. So we're going to mute that. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. So let's take a look at this idea. I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place. Now, tell me about what this man looks like.
A beggar or
What do you know about him?
He's not well clothed.
He's got rags. Okay. You guys are making all kinds of inferences. He's wearing rags. Okay. What else? That's all you know about him. Is he average height? Is he tall? Is he good looking? Is he powerful? Is he strong? Does he look like Inigo Montoya? Does he look like the giant? What does he look like? We don't know. Now, why would Bunyan, in a story in which he's writing about this main character, because this is our main character, not give you any details on what the guy looks like, what he's about, who he's from, what his background is, or anything else?
Could be anybody.
He could be anybody.
So it's easier to picture yourself.
Okay, keep going. You're right. He's not. He's anyone. But keep going. There's a good reason why none of that is listed. Think about this.
So you can't dismiss it as not being relative to you.
Good. Because who is it relative to?
Everyone.
Keep going. Not everyone. From God's perspective, does God care whether you're short, tall, man, woman, what time you lived in, what culture you lived in, what your background was? Does he care so much about whether you've been incredibly successful or whether you've been a complete deadbeat? Do all those things matter? Yes. Does any of that matter to God in terms of how he sees you? Is there anything else, when God looks at you, when we look at our Bibles, is there anything else that defines you besides how you stand before God? Does that make sense? Because ultimately, it's not the same. The way I was when I was 18, the way I was when I was 25, the way I was when I was 40, I wish I could say when I'm going to be 40, but when I was 40, right? All the times have changed. My situation has changed. My mindset has changed. The way I act has changed. My struggles have changed. The things that I'm good at have hopefully changed. All those things have grown or disappeared or changed, right? So nothing's static in this world. But how I stand before God, that is all that matters. So do we care about anyone in terms of what they do? Yes, from an interest standpoint, but when we look at them from God's point of view, nothing matters except the fact that this man was clothed in rags. Now, what are rags? Where do we see rags listed in the Bible? In Isaiah 46. It says, everyone's clothed in rags. All your good works are nothing but rags, filthy rags. And more specifically, that means menstrual cloths would be more appropriate. Okay? So it's filthy rags. So this man is clothed in rags. Now, knowing that Isaiah talked about your righteousness is nothing but filthy rags, what is this man clothed in? Self-righteousness. Does that mean that this man is a total deadbeat? Is he a drunk? Is he a guy that's always in jail? Does it sound like he's a murderer? We don't know. What is he clothed in? Self-righteousness. So if we were to look at this, what do you think this man is all about? Yeah, he's probably a decent guy. He's probably a churchgoer. He's probably moral. He's probably trying to generally do the right thing. This is not necessarily, it could be, but it's not necessarily a guy that's a complete waste of space. He's clothed in rags. He's trying to do the right thing. He's an everyman who doesn't have any necessarily outstanding conditions, but before God, he stands clothed in rags. All he's got is his self-righteousness. He may mean well, he may be trying his hardest to be a good guy, but ultimately, all he's got is rags.
So the people who read that early on and hated Bunyan and wanted to shut him down, they had figured out that he was talking about them.
I don't know if he was talking about that. He was more likely, Bunyan takes, you'll see a lot of references to the Anglican Church and churchgoers. Because at the time you grew up, you were, by default, you were Christian, specifically Anglican. And so there was a lot of people that he met that went to the church that weren't saved.
Right.
And so more often than not, when you see things like that, that's who he was more taking aim at. Was the casual churchgoer, the default Christians, where the heart had never been changed. And he's trying to talk to them about, there's more to religion than just going to church. So if you really want to look at it, that's probably who he has in mind. People that are going, they're earning a living, they're taking care of their family, but they're ultimately unsaved.
And you would think that would be the same concern that the Anglican leaders would have. And so I'm just
You
trying
would
to figure out
think.
why they hated him.
Well, it wasn't. He didn't share his work with the Anglican church. He was getting hit by other pastors that he knew. So other nonconformist pastors that most of the time took issue with his style, less of his content.
Okay.
Yeah.
Message is good, but it's entertaining. It's funny.
Yep.
So
Yep.
can't do that.
That was the issue.
Talking donkeys are not fun.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Talking donkeys. There was, Jeremiah sitting there on one side, facing one direction forever.
Right.
God uses all kinds of symbols, but Bunyan wasn't allowed to. God's allowed to do that because he knows what he's doing. You, on the other hand, Mr. Bunyan, forget it.
Okay.
All right. So I saw a man clothed with rags, standing in a certain place, with his face from his own house, a book in his hand, and a great burden on his back. Standing in a certain place. Is he moving? He's standing. Why is he standing?
He's not progressing.
He's not progressing because he's not going anywhere because
He doesn't know where to go.
he's got nowhere to go. That's the sinner, right? I got nowhere this is as good as it gets.
Right.
There's nowhere for me to go. Not yet, right? Now, his face is from his own house. Why would he include that description?
He's not looking towards his home. He's not thinking about his earthly possessions, his family.
Good.
He's looking for something better. Looking for something.
Oh, you guys need to get out of your Christian mindsets. This man is not saved. This man has yet to move on his Christian journey. He has not been directed where to go. So it's not that he's looking for something better. It's not that he's leaving all his earthly possessions.
He's thinking of himself.
He's thinking of himself, and what is he not finding at home?
What he wants.
What he wants. What's that?
He wants to choose his dream.
He wants to chase his dream. Well, almost. Okay? He has a burden on his back. So what he's looking for isn't necessarily something better as I'm looking for an answer. This is uncomfortable. The burden for itself, if you want a visual, it's actually taken from Psalm 38, where the psalmist talks about a burden. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. If you want a visual, Bunyan was a tinker. That means he used to work with metal. He actually had a portable anvil that weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 pounds. And he used to just fling it over his back and carry it into wherever he was working. Okay? So he would actually carry this anvil in and put it down. So this picture of this man with an anvil strapped to his back, right? We're not talking like, I guess Wile E. Coyote always had an anvil. And I remember he always had to carry it like this. Now imagine this guy has this, and that's what he has to carry around everywhere he goes. But unlike Bunyan, who would take it, put it down, and then do his work, this guy always has this anvil attached to him. He's always carrying around this burden. So as he's looking away from his home, what is he looking for? Very simply, relief. I want to put this burden down. I do not want to carry it around. Does that make sense? So when you guys think about something better, you're right, we'll get there. But at the moment, what Bunyan's picturing is a man who is convicted of sin. And what is he carrying in his hand? A book. And as he reads in the book, guess what makes the burden continually heavier? You see what's happening? He's standing there. He has nowhere to go. He's reading in his Bible. The book is the Bible. He's reading in his Bible about sin. And as he reads about sin and the holiness of God and what God thinks about men, then it just adds to the burden in his back. And his burden just keeps getting heavier and heavier. And so he sits there and he says, I can't find an answer. And I'm just standing here looking around. I don't find it at home. So I'm just standing here looking. I don't know where to go. I have nowhere to go. All I know is I've got a burden, and every time I read this book, that burden gets a little heavier. Does that make sense? This is not a man who's seen something better and he's going to it. This is simply a man who understands sin, his own sin and the sin around him, and he's growing in desperation. Does that make sense? Now, why is that important? You guys bring up the fact that, well, why doesn't he just get right into the gospel? Because that's not where God starts. God doesn't start with, I have a wonderful plan for your life, now let me tell you about sin. God tells you, let me expose you to who I am and who you are, and then we'll start making that connection. You are at enmity with you. Let me introduce you to your enemy, is basically what God does when he invades the heart. Makes sense? So this man standing with this book, with this burden growing on his back. And I looked, Bunyan says, and saw him open the book and read therein. And as he read, he wept and trembled. And not being able longer to contain, he brake out with a lamentable cry, saying, "What shall I do?" So he is the man, like the Philippian jailer, like the Ethiopian sinner that says, I'm reading this, and as I read it, I'm filled with fear. I don't know what to do. Okay? Now, this brings up an interesting point. Bunyan loves the Word of God. This man's reading the Bible. He's growing in the burden. And then he breaks out, what am I going to do? Well, gosh, if I'm reading the Bible, what is in the Bible?
Right,
The answer. Right? The gospel is in the Bible. And yet, as he reads it, what is he reading? What shall I do? So he's making a conclusion. This man is reading his book and reaching a conclusion. This man is reading his book and reaching the conclusion, I don't know what to do. I am in trouble. What should I do from here? And yet he's reading his Bible, which both has the prognosis as well as the cure. But which one is he seeing?
He's seeing the disease.
All he sees is the disease. Okay? Why is that?
Well, because he can't fix it himself. He can't just make a decision.
He can't fix it himself. He can't make a decision. Good. And as he reads his book, what else has to happen?
God has to open his eyes.
Right. See, that's key. The book is nothing but a book. It's nothing but a book until God opens your eyes to see the power of God in the gospel. Does that make sense? When we look at the Bible, what matters is those things that are spiritual can only be discerned spiritually. But when God opens your eyes, then you see everything. Well, guess what? God started to open this man's eyes. And so what has he seen so far? He's starting to see the disease. Yes, he's had it forever. He's had the leprosy for his entire life. He just never bothered to look. And now all of a sudden, by God's providence, he's opened this book and started saying, oh my gosh, look what's on my arm. Whoa, it's all over. I'm covered. And he starts looking and he can't forget what he sees. But God has stopped so far at this point before giving him the cure. He's got to get a little bit more desperate. And he's working. He is getting desperate. Okay? Now, what would you do if you had a book that kept telling you bad news?
Stop reading.
You would typically stop reading it. But there's something about this book that keeps him reading. Something about this book. So Bunyan's telling you, when God calls upon your heart, there is no denying it. You cannot escape. All right. In this plight, therefore, he went home and refrained himself as long as he could, that his wife and children should not perceive his distress. But he could not be silent long, because that his trouble increased. All right. So he goes home. He's under conviction. He tries to play it off. I'm trying to be a good guy, trying to pretend like it's nothing going on. I'm good, honey. Hi. No. It's nothing. It's just a hard day at work. Right? But at length he brake his mind to his wife and children, and thus he began to talk to them. "O my dear wife," said he, "and you, the children of my bowels." That's a great way to address your children. They'll be. "I, your dear friend, am in myself undone, by reason of a burden that lieth hard upon me. Moreover, I am for certain informed that this our city will be burned with fire from heaven, in which fearful overthrow both myself and thee, my wife, and you, my sweet babes, shall miserably come to ruin, except, the which yet I see not, some way of escape can be found whereby we may be delivered." So he tries to put on the good face. It's not working. Why? Because as he keeps reading, what keeps growing? Desperation, because
Or his conviction.
his conviction. Keep going. What is he seeing more and more and more and more and more?
Judgment.
Judgment because of sin. And where does he see sin now? Everywhere. In his heart, in the hearts of his people. This is the city of destruction, he says. If we continue, this entire city, that's everyone, all of us, are going to be wiped out. We're all in the same boat. Romans 3, for all have fallen short of the glory of God. All of us. We're all in the same boat. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that we're in trouble. All right. So as children saying, oh, Father, as children of your bowels, we completely believe in what you're saying. They're probably teenagers, most likely by the response. So they say, oh, wow, Dad, that's real interesting. At this, his relations were sore amazed. Well, that's good, right? They're listening. Not that they believed what he said. Not that what he said was true, but because they thought that some frenzied distemper had got into his head. So, they didn't believe a word he said. They just thought he was going a little crazy. Okay? Dad, you're kind of losing it. Okay? You're going a little too far. We get it. You're kind of under some stress. But you're going to have to, you got to do something about this. This is getting a little out of hand, don't you think? This whole religion thing that you're into. I mean, really, it's going too far. It's going too far. Okay? Therefore, it drawing towards the night, and they hoping that sleep might settle his brains, with all haste they got him into bed. But the night was as troublesome to him as the day. Wherefore, instead of sleeping, he spent it in sighs and tears. So they said, Dad, how about you just take some time, get away from it all, kind of put yourself together, maybe find purpose, go do something else. Okay, take your mind off the stressful situation. That's basically what they're saying. Okay, it's nighttime. He's supposed to be resting. Go get some rest. Let's see what happens. Maybe this whole religion thing will all work itself out of your system. Okay, but he finds out that as he's left to himself, what does he find? Well, the same problem that all the monks found when they went into the desert. You can escape a lot of things, but you can never escape yourself. And so as he goes out, he sits in the night, and all he can spend the night is in sighs and tears because it hasn't solved his problem. All it did was isolate it. Make sense? One of my favorite movies, The Beautiful Mind. In The Beautiful Mind, he keeps seeing things that aren't really there. And no matter where he goes, those things go with him because they're all in his head. It's a great picture here. No matter where he goes, he cannot get rid of these sins, this burden. He can't go away, so it keeps bothering him. So when the morning was come, they would know how he did. He told them worse and worse. He also set to talking to them again, but they began to be hardened. So now before they were kind of like, Dad, we got to help you out with this. Now it's saying, okay, you've gone just too far. This is enough. This religion stuff you're talking about, it's just too much. We're done with this. Okay? So they become hardened. And so these are, for example, what Bunyan's trying to bring up is not just interesting story. He's trying to summarize what it's like as you go through conviction and you're talking to unbelieving family or close friends or whatever, and their possible reactions to you. Okay? How does the world perceive a godly conviction? The first one is, why don't you just get some rest and see what happens? Okay, maybe you'll work out this whole midlife crisis thing. Let's go buy you a Porsche, okay, and see if that all helps. And okay, it's not happening, right? So let's have him relax. Well, he's relaxing isn't helping. He keeps sticking with this whole sin thing. So you know what? This is getting a little irritating. So also they sought to drive away his distemper by harsh and surly carriages. Sometimes they would deride, sometimes they would chide, and sometimes they would quite neglect him. So our reactions to this, right, was to ridicule him. Let's make him see how silly he really sounds. Let's treat him with disdain. And what's the hope there? What are they hoping to do if they ridicule him? Right. What are they? Because if you look at it, and before we get too harsh on these ones, what does his family want? The use of his family was a great illustration. What would his family want? This man is depressed, he's sick, he's discouraged, he doesn't know what to do. What do they want?
Come back home to that.
They want him to come back home as who?
He was.
As he was. I want my dad back.
Right.
I want you to be the fun-loving guy that we always used to. Even, it's weird, when you look at dysfunctional families, as weird as you look at it and say, oh my gosh, look, this dad's a deadbeat, and mom's crazy. But a lot of times the kids just want some sense of consistency. Even if that consistency is a train wreck, at least it's consistent train wreck. And so these kids, this wife, say, I just want my husband back. I want my father back the way I knew him. This is not the man I knew. Is that necessarily a bad thing? No, not from our perspective. But they just want him back. And he's acting weird. So before we get too down on them and say, oh my gosh, these guys are crazy for wanting to stop this godly conviction, just understand from their standpoint, they want him the way he was. Sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes it actually is. But the point is, they don't want him in the way that God wants him. They want him the way they want him. And so they're doing what they can to try to get to the man that they knew. Do you see the thought process that's going on? So they're trying to. So the first thing they do is try to make him feel ridiculous. And if they make him feel ridiculous, then maybe he'll give it all up and come back to them. The other possibility, they would scold or rebuke him. What are you doing? Right? What are you doing? This world is so full of goodness and grace and beauty, right? This is what MacArthur says. Our culture has declared war on guilt. The very concept is considered medieval, obsolete, unproductive. People who trouble themselves with feelings of personal guilt are usually referred to therapists whose task it is to boost their self-image. No one, after all, is supposed to feel guilty. Guilt is not conducive to dignity and self-esteem. Society encourages sin, but it will not tolerate the guilt that sin produces. Does that make sense? So they don't want him, so they're going to start rebuking him. Stop being so religious. This is not good for you. This is not good for the people around you. This is not good for your family. All the things they're going to come up with, they're going to scold him for telling him that he's wrong. And then finally, what's the last thing that they would do? If that doesn't work, you just turn your back on him. You just decide you're going to ignore him. Just ignore it. Yeah. We're not going to talk about this whole religious thing, Dad. We're done. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We'll talk about the Broncos. We'll debate the politics. We'll talk about the latest tweet from Trump, but we are not going to talk about the whole sin thing. Okay? So, wherefore he began to retire himself to his chamber to pray for and pity them, and also to condole his own misery. He would walk solitary in the fields, sometimes reading, sometimes praying, and thus for some days he spent his time. So it's been quite a while now. Some days he's out in the field. And what did Jesus tell the apostles, the disciples, as they were talking, as they met the Samaritan woman? Look around, for the fields are white with harvest. This man is in the fields, right? Now, I saw upon a time when he was walking in the fields that he was, as he was wont, as he typically did, reading his book, greatly distressed in his mind. So if you notice, this book and this burden are connected. Nowhere does this conviction come without this book, period. If you take away the book, the conviction goes with it. If you take away the book, this whole story falls apart. There's no point in this whole story if he doesn't have this book. Okay? That's why the book keeps coming up over and over again in this story. Okay, understand Bunyan's perspective. Nothing happens without this book. If we take away the book, we're back to, who is this man? It doesn't matter. He can be a king, he can be a pauper, it doesn't really matter. This book is the thing that sets him apart.
So when he's, were you reading from the text? You said that he was weeping and praying for his family?
Yep.
What happened to make him know to do that? Is he getting saved yet?
No, but he's not necessarily praying for their salvation. He's in the same boat. He already told them, we're all in the same boat. We got to find some way of escape. So this isn't necessarily a man who's praying, I hope that they would come to know Jesus. This is a man praying, I want something better for my family.
I see.
And that's a very generic prayer, right?
Okay.
Every father across any culture has made that prayer,
Okay.
right? At this point, he's still praying to this aimless whatever, okay? And that's okay. That's where God's starting with him, okay? Now I saw upon a time that he was walking in the fields. He was, as he wont, reading in his book, greatly distressed in his mind. And as he read, he burst out, as he had done before, crying, what shall I do to be saved? So he's walking in the field. Now, upon a certain time, you're going to find these. A certain time, you'll find just the right time, when God would have it, right? What's he pointing at? Knowing Bunyan's a good Calvinist, what's he pointing at when he uses those kind of statements?
Providence.
Providence. Good, solid, sovereign providence. When the time was right. Just as God's timing would have it. He left him. He struggled with this. He struggled with the way that people are treating him. He struggles with reading his Bible. He's depressed. He's lonely. He's miserable. And he was left in it for days in our story. And now, at just the right time, okay, as he was in the field, I saw also that he looked this way and that way, as if he would run. Right? Yet he stood still because, as I perceived, he could not tell which way to go. So he looks this way. I'm hoping. Where is he looking? He goes down to the Christian bookstore. He's looking at all the Christian self-help books. What's my top 10? Oh my gosh, there's, Purpose-Driven Life. Oh, that's wonderful. Let me try that. Okay, well, that didn't work. Okay, well, let me try the Ezekiel diet. Maybe that'll help me. It's just a natural thing. Okay, well, that didn't work. Let me try this. So you can see how all those things are out there. And maybe even some of them have purpose. I'm not going to say all of them do, but some of them have purpose. But every time he tries something different, he looks this way. Should I run that way? Nope. And then he looks this way. He tries to take a couple steps that way. That didn't work. I don't know where to go, so I'm just going to stand still. Not because I don't want to run. I don't know where to go. None of these things have helped solve my burden. Not, I want something better. I just want to be done with this burden. I don't want to die. I don't want to be here when the destruction comes. I want to leave. I want to get rid of this burden. Do you notice how this isn't necessarily a hunger and a thirst for heaven? Right now, it's just simply a hunger and a thirst to be done with this burden.
Take the pain away.
Do you see what's happening? Take the pain away. Okay. He answered, so he said, I also saw you look this way and that way, as if he would run. He could not tell which way to go. I looked then and saw a man named Evangelist coming to him, who asked, wherefore dost thou cry? Now, this is interesting. So this man named Evangelist comes. Now, when I say evangelist, what picture comes to your mind?
TV evangelist.
TV evangelist, yeah. Fletch 2, Chevy Chase. Yeah, I get that one too, because that's one of my favorite. I love that illustration. But leaving aside Chevy Chase, what else comes to your mind with evangelist? Besides Jim and Tammy Faye Baker.
Billy Graham.
Billy Graham, good. Keep going. What does an evangelist do?
Proclaims the gospel.
Proclaims the gospel. What else?
For reconciliation.
Okay.
It helps clear the muddy waters
Clears the muddy waters. In what way?
by the gospel, by shedding the truth, not to what people read, like Philip with the Ethiopian.
Okay. So they shed the truth. They shed the light on the gospel, on the light on the world through the gospel. Okay.
I think the old time gospel, evangelists, the tent.
The
like
tent.
Billy Grahams.
The Billy Grahams. Yep.
They come
Yep.
to a city.
Good. So the traveling evangelist.
Traveling.
Yep. And that was alive and well this time. Okay. And that was, in fact, when they go over to the United States, that becomes a big deal, especially in the South, right? Now, here, though, Bunyan himself would actually be invited to go place to place. He had an issue with altar calls, however. He was not thrilled with them. Because the problem with that kind of evangelism, it comes out, it throws out the gospel. People say, oh my gosh, they're emotionally overwhelmed. They come forward. Okay, well, that's great. Is that what an evangelist is called to do? What is the command given in Matthew 28? Go therefore and spread the gospel.
Make disciples.
Make disciples. How are disciples made? When Jesus, the master evangelist, the master teacher, when he chose disciples, was it just called them, gave them a charge, and then walked away? No, we're talking life poured into. Okay? So when Bunyan sees an evangelist, he has no issue with a man that goes from here to there looking for people in the fields. He's okay with people going out into the harvest, into the fields to find a harvest. But what we'll see with evangelists is it's not just, hey, here's the gospel, 4 spiritual laws, Godspeed, right? This man is not only for starting you off on your journey, this man is for seeing you complete it. So you're going to see him come back over and over again, actually 4 times, I think, 3 or 4 times in the book. He's going to meet Christian at different places in his walk. Some before he comes to faith, and some after he comes to faith. Does that make sense? So this evangelist is not for simply spreading the gospel, though he does do that. This evangelist is all about getting you to the celestial city, bringing you to God. I want to see you as we talk about our purposes in life. He's in Colossians 1:28. Him we preach, warning every man, teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may present every man perfect, complete in Christ Jesus. To this end I also labor, striving according to his work. Ephesians 4. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints to the work of ministry, for the edifying of the believers. Ready? Till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So this evangelist is not just go hang door hangers. That's an aspect. It's not just go sit on a corner and street preach. That may be an aspect. An evangelist is one that wants to see these people that he meets on a daily basis, the people that God has brought into his life, to see them come to faith. And if that means talking to them as an unbeliever who's carrying a book and a burden, then I'm going to do that. If it's talking to 2 men who have been walking in the faith for a little while now, and now they're about to go through a challenge, then I'm going to encourage them to keep walking on their faith. It doesn't really matter. My goal is to see you reach the end. And sometimes that means starting you off, and sometimes that means encouraging you to finish. But either way, that's the role of an evangelist. So evangelism is not necessarily just a front-end kind of thing. Evangelism is taking the gospel and applying it to the current situation of that believer, of that person. Disbeliever or believer, unbeliever or believer. Does that make sense? That's how Bunyan sees evangelist. So evangelist, you're going to love evangelist. Evangelist will now kick him off on the right way. Evangelist will come back and give him a swift kick in the butt before picking him up off the ground when he meets worldly wise man. And then he's going to come back and he's going to meet Christian and faithful as they go into Vanity Fair. Okay? So we'll see this as we go. So evangelist comes up to him. And he says, wherefore dost thou cry, Christian, or sorry, not Christian, the unnamed man, answered, Sir, I perceive by the book in my hand that I am condemned to die, and after that to come to judgment. And I find that I am not willing to do the first, nor able to do the second. I'm condemned to die. I really don't want that to happen. And then there's going to be judgment, and I can't defend myself. I got nothing. This is what he's got from the book. So this entire Bible is now, in his mind, has 2 main points to his life. One, that he's going to die, and the second, that he's going to come to judgment. That's his summary of what he reads in his Bible. This whole thick book is down to 2 points for him. That's kind of a miserable life, wouldn't you say? Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about the slough of despond, and that's going to be important to remember. That right now is what is in this book. Then said evangelist, why not willing to die, since this life is attended with so many evils? Now, this is incredibly insightful. Evangelist, this man, now I know I'm going to die, I'm going to come to judgment. What should evangelist say? Repent. The man already knows he's a sinner. The man already has condemnation written out. The man is already burdened. He's in tears. What shall I do to be saved? What should evangelists, you would think, say right at that moment?
Believe on the Lord, right?
Go believe on Jesus. He doesn't say that. Why don't you want to die? This world already kind of sucks. Why don't you want to die anyways?
To see if he knows that there's something else.
Well, that's what he's testing for. He's testing for something, isn't he? What's he testing for? Do Mormons believe this is a perfect world? Do Catholics believe this is a perfect world? Do Buddhists believe this is a perfect world? Muslims? So what are they saying? Everybody believes that this world is difficult. Everybody believes that there's something wrong. So what does evangelist do before he launches into the gospel? He gets to know this man. Let me ask some questions. Let me find out whether this is a real sorrow or a worldly sorrow. Because that's going to tell him where to start. He wants to know where this man is at. Sadness, depression, disappointment are not necessarily, they could be, but they aren't necessarily indicative of a godly conviction.
Correct. Sorry versus sorry you got caught.
Yeah. There's a difference between I'm sorry I did it versus I'm sorry I got caught doing it. Those are two completely different things. Okay? So as we look at this, evangelist doesn't start with, oh, I'm just going to start throwing out seed every which way and see what I can do. It's, hey, I'm talking to this man. This is who God brought into me. Let's talk about where you're really at. Why don't you want to die? Why don't you want to die? This world is already difficult. Why don't you want to die? The man answered, because I fear that this burden that is upon my back will sink me lower than the grave, and I shall fall into Tophet. Okay? Tophet was, or it could also be Topheth. It's a region located in the valley of Hinnom. It was a region where the followers of Molech and Baal sacrificed children by burning them alive. In Jeremiah 7, it became a representative of death and destruction that Yahweh would pour out, sort of like Sodom and Gomorrah, if you will. So he's afraid that his burden is going to take him down to hell. All right, now we know where this man really sits. His godly conviction is not, his conviction is not necessarily just that he's depressed about the way things have gone. He's not just saying nobody's perfect, and that includes me. Now he's actually saying, I'm afraid that if I die now, I'm going to face God and I'm going to be destroyed. I am going to be sent to hell. And sir, if I be not fit to go to prison, I am not fit, I am sure, to go to judgment, and thence to execution, and the thoughts of these things make me cry. Now we see that this is not just a worldly conviction, it's a godly conviction. So what does evangelist do? We'll finish here. Then said evangelist, if this be thy condition, why are you standing still? He answered, because I don't know where to go. Then he gave him a parchment roll, and there was written within, fly from the wrath to come. All right. So the Bible, he hasn't read the gospel yet. He doesn't understand the gospel. But evangelist starts to say, here's a book that says, so what is he doing? He's not really giving him a new book. Okay, it says he gives him a parchment roll. That's not what Budden's trying to say, is that he gives him a whole other book. What he really is trying to do is basically saying, let me tell you this other page in John. Let's go and open our Bibles and let's talk about what's in Romans. You've got through Romans 1, 2, and 3. Let's keep going on now to Romans 4, 5, 6. Right? Let's talk about Romans 7. You got that struggle down. Let's talk about Romans 8. Now, there are no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So he starts opening those words to him. Okay? Does that make sense? And they're flee from the wrath to come. But where does he go? Okay? This is interesting. The man therefore read it, and looking upon Evangelist very carefully, said, whither must I fly? Then said Evangelist, pointing with his finger over a very wide field, says, do you see yonder wicket gate? Okay? Our wicket gate. Now imagine, for the gate analogy, imagine that all these bushes are basically they didn't have fences. So they used to grow up those really thick hedges. Right? You see in the Bible, put a hedge around me kind of thing. That was what it was. They made their hedges really, really thick and thorny, and they were like fences. Okay? So the only way to get through those big hedges was through a gate. Does that make sense? So you couldn't just go around the gate. It's not like Blazing Saddles where they just had the thing in there and you could just go around it like that and they never figured it out. This was a solid wall with a gate right in the middle, and you had to go through the gate if you wanted to make it through. Okay? So he says, go to that gate. Now, what's important? First, of all the things that evangelists could have pointed to, what are two things that he did not point to? What do you think?
Heaven?
Hmm?
The celestial city?
He didn't point to the celestial city, true.
He didn't point that there's multiple ways
Yep.
over there.
Very specifically pointed once, right? Did he point to himself? Why not? Where was the answer? Not in him. Right? That's pretty key. I don't have an answer for you, but I know who does. Right? I can help inform you. I am a great signpost to point you in the right direction, but I myself have nothing to offer you. Make sense? Second, he doesn't point backwards. There's nothing behind you that's going to offer you salvation. So run that way. He says, run towards that gate. And the man said, he says, do you see that wicket gate? And the man said, no. Well, hold on. What does that make sense? I mean, this is supposed to be, what I was expecting was, do you see that cross over there? Go, run, go wholeheartedly. Instead, he says, do you see that wicket gate? And the man says, no, I don't see it. Okay? He says, okay, well, do you see the yonder shining light? And he said, I think I do. Then the man says, keep that light in your eye and go directly thereto, so that shalt thou see the gate, at which thou, when thou knockest, it shall be told you what you should do. All right. It's an interesting little turn of events. So he says, go to that gate, not to go to the cross. We'll get the cross understanding, it's there. But he says, go to that gate. I don't see the gate. Well, then go towards that light. So kind of think of it as, here's the gate, here's the light, right? So now what is evangelist doing? What is Bunyan picturing the evangelist is doing? This is the layers of complication on the story. It's not that he's simply just saying, hey, just give him the gospel, everything works out. He's being realistic about this. He says, do you see the yonder wicket gate? Do you see in the Bible what this gospel is talking about? No, I don't understand what I'm reading. All right, well, let's start painting pictures that are a little bit broader brush. So evangelist doesn't have just one single string that he can say. Instead, he says, do you get this? No? All right, well, let's start talking about more general terms. Let's talk about different things. Let's talk about it a different way. Let's get it so that you get to the point. He's not saying, just start going any which direction and hope that God figures it all out for me. He is saying, go towards that light, knowing that that light will lead into the gate, and that gate will lead into the cross. Does that make sense? So he's taking this and saying, if you don't get the direct, simple application, if you will, if you don't get all the details, well, let's start working this way, and we'll start narrowing it down as you go. Does that make sense? So he says, go towards the light. He knows that if he goes towards this light, he will make it to the gate. And so he's not afraid to trust that God will bring this man who doesn't quite get it yet, but he's on the right track. So he trusts that God's going to get it. He sends him out in the providence of God, and he sends him in the right direction. Okay? Go towards that light. Go towards that light, and when you get there, the wicket gate will be his head. This is what Barry Horner said. If this pilgrim will but persevere in the word of God, limited though his present knowledge may be, he will come to a time when the day dawns and the morning star arises in his heart. Christian only just perceives the light ahead, but he is assured that if he pursues this true light in his book, then when the wicket gate will eventually be sighted with greater clarity, and in particular, Jesus Christ's beckoning will be clearly seen. So the man says, start running. Start running towards that light. Okay? So as we'll stop next week, he's going to start running. And guess what the first thing he finds is? Opposition. He's running, and everybody else thinks he's crazy for running. Okay? And then they're going to try to get to him to stop. So the next thing we're going to meet are two men named Obstinate and Pliable, as well as Christian's neighbors. Okay, we're going to talk a little more about obstinate. Pliable will carry us over into what's called the slough of despond. All right, and so if you think about that term, despondency. Okay, that's the term that we would use more frequently. Is another term for kind of desperation, hopelessness, things like that. But the hard part is this slough, like a swamp of despondency, is placed before the cross. And we're going to find that many people don't make it out of the slough. Okay? That's going to be the challenge to this book. Bunyan's very, like I said, the guy is incredibly insightful. So the situations that he's seeing are things that he's actually seen. He doesn't just say, hey, there's a man with conviction, go to the cross. He says, here's a man with conviction who's not getting the gospel. Let me set him in the right direction. How is this going to work out? What are the challenges he's going to face? See how this is working? Does that make sense? You guys getting what an allegory is so far?